Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is the 5th episode of my ReactJS course. And today what we're going to be going over is how to create some sort of like CRUD application in React. So the example we're going to follow is the most classic example, which is to build a to-do list. And the reason why I chose this example is because it was the example that really got me good at and help me understand how states work in React. So this episode specifically will be packed with a bunch of logic stuff that are going to be fundamental for your React knowledge. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Check out the code in the description, and yeah, stick around as well for the exercise at the end of the video. And yeah, that's basically it. So let's get into the video. Okay everyone, so let's get started writing the code for our first CRUD application in React, where we're going to be building a to-do list. So like I mentioned, this episode will be mainly focused on emphasizing how to use states and enforcing the best practices when you're using states, and exactly why you would use states in React. Because when you create something like a to-do list, states are extremely important. So that's the whole point of us making this video. So I have over here just an empty application, just like we had before. You see there's only 3 files, and I just have hello world written over here. And what we want to build is we want to build an app where over here in the website there's going to be a list for like tasks that you might want to complete, and inside of that list, each task will either be colored green for completed or just white for not completed yet. So you can basically check them to say that you've completed a task, and if you did, the task will become green. You can also delete a task if you want to. We're gonna add all of those functionalities, and obviously you will be able to add a new task to your list. Now, if you're interested in seeing how this will look, you can just go to the end of the video where I'm going to be showing this. But basically, this is one of the best projects in my opinion. I know it's overused and there's a lot of tutorials out there for this already, but there's no way I'm going to make a React course without including this, because this was definitely one of the projects that got me understanding what states are and how they are used. So that's why I decided to make this video. So let's get started right now. I'm going to open up VS Code over here. I basically want to create a div over here because we're going to divide our project, our website, into two, right? 2 parts UI wise, right? We're going to have over here a top part where there's going to be an input and a button, because we're going to be able to write which task we want to complete. And there's going to be a button which, when we click on it, we're going to be able to add the task to our list. So we're going to have that part, and we can even give a class name over here of something like inputs, or actually I'll just call it add task, something like this, right? It's just a part where you're going to be able to add a new task to your list. And then we're going to have another div, which is going to be the div with a list. Now, this whole course, I don't want to focus at all on CSS because that's not important in my opinion for someone learning React. Although it is important for a website, it is not important for React. So what I'm going to do is, whenever I add some minor CSS, I'm just going to show you guys the CSS, and you guys can just look at it, use it if you want to. But I'm not going to be wasting my time of this course teaching you guys CSS, because it's not the point of the course. But over here, we have 2 divs, and on this div over here, what we want to put is, we want to put an input and a button. So 2 things. The button will be the add task button. So we'll look over here, and you'll see right now we have the input and the button. And over here is where we're going to display the list of tasks, which obviously initially will be empty, but let's leave this for now and just focus on this part over here. So what we want is, we want to have some sort of variable inside of our application, which is going to keep track of a list of tasks, right? So we could have a task, for example, do homework, right? Where we're just saying that I need to do homework. Or we can also have a task which is wash dishes, right? Something like this. So a good data structure that could hold the information about which tasks we have to complete is an array, right? It's a list, an array. So what we want over here is we need to have a variable which is going to keep track of our list of tasks. And we want to dynamically change how the variable looks, because we want to display the list in our screen. And whenever we make any changes to the list, we want to re-render the UI to show the new changes. A change would be, for example, adding a new task to the list. We want to immediately see that new task appear over here. Or when we delete or when we complete, we want to see those changes appearing immediately. So the way we're going to do that is by creating a state, which is what we learned in the previous video. So if you want to refresh, you can watch the previous video to see how you create a state. But the way you do it is you basically say const, you open and close square brackets like this, and you set it equal to the use state hook. And we obviously need to import the use state hook from React. So I'm going to say import from React, and we're going to import the hook that we're using, use state. So to declare this hook, we need to give a name for the variable. I'm going to call it TodoList, and a function that will be used to change the value of this variable. So I'm going to call it setTodoList. Then, like I mentioned in the previous video of this course, you need to set an initial value for this variable, or for the state. So the initial value will be an empty array, because initially this list will be empty. So this can be a good initial value, right? What we want to do over here is we want to be able to, whenever you click on this list, we want to add something to, you want to add that task to the list, right? But in order to do that, we need to keep track of the value of what is inside of this input. So if I write over here, do homework, we need to get the information. We need to get this do homework string inside of this input and use it to add into our list. And the way I taught you guys in the previous episode to get information from an input is by creating a state to represent the input value. So I'm going to create another state over here, and I'm going to call it, we can call it whatever we want. I'm going to call it new task, because it's going to represent whatever we're writing on the input when we want to add a new task. And then I'm going to say set new task like this. And I'm going to set this equal to use state, and it will be a string initially, right? Because it's a string inside of an input. So now we have two states, and this is basically what is necessary for our to-do list. So what we want to do now is we want to make it so that whenever you type on this input, you now keep track, or you update this new task state to represent the value inside of that input. Now, the way you do this, as I mentioned in the previous episode, is you can give an onChange function to this input. So whenever there's any change to the input's value, so whenever you type a letter in the input, this function over here, whatever function you pass inside of this, will be called. So we're going to come over here and create the handle change function like this. And inside of here, we're going to write the logic for this. So we're just going to copy handle change and put it inside of here. Now, inside of this handle change function, since it is inside of an input, like I mentioned, you can have an event as an argument to this function. And you can use that event to grab the value of the input. So if I want to set the variable a new task to be equal to the value of the input, all I have to say is set new task equal to event.target.value. Now, all of this, like I mentioned, I've talked about this in the previous episode, but it's extremely important for me to show myself using it again in a better context, so you guys keep refreshing how everything works and understand how everything will be used. So now what we have over here is we have a variable called new task, which I'm gonna even, just for now, just to show you guys that this is working, I'll just display this in our screen over here, in our UI, new task, and you'll see that it is actually working. As I type on this input, it is setting the variable new task to be equal to whatever's over here. And the only reason why we're seeing it over here is because I just decided to display it as I go, just to show you guys that it's working. So I'm going to delete this for now, because this is not the point of this video. But it's good to know that it is working, the handle change function. So now that we have this new task variable and we have access to what the user is typing on the input, we want to be able to add to this array over here the new task that we just typed on the input. So the way we're going to do that is we have this button over here, which whenever it's clicked, we want to add to the list. So we're gonna create a function over here and call it add task, right? Because it is the function that is gonna be called when we wanna add a new task to the list. And then inside of this button, we're gonna give it an on-click property because we're gonna say that whenever you click on the button, we wanna call the add task function. So we haven't worked previously with using states and lists before, but states and lists are extremely interesting because it is very common for you to use it, and they're gonna appear so many times that it is important for you to get good with it. Now, when you have a normal array, and I want to emphasize this to you guys, when you have a normal array, right? Imagine I had this array over here, which was just an array, an empty array. Usually in JavaScript, if you want to add a value to that array, for example, I want to add the variable name, which is equal to Pedro. If I want to add Pedro to the array, I could say something like array.push and put name over here, right? And this would work. We would see that now after this, array would have the name inside of it, right? But this doesn't work with states. And the reason why it doesn't work with states is because we don't mutate the state directly. Remember, with states, we always have to use the function that is used to mutate the value. So I can't just say something like new task is equal to event.target.value. This is why we have to put the value inside of the function parameters, not by setting them like this. So I couldn't say something like array.push. But what I can do is I can create a new array, for example, new to-do list, and say that whenever I want to add a new task, I basically want to have a new to-do list which is made out of the old to-do list with the addition of the new task that we want to add. If you're not familiar with this thing over here, this is the spread operator, and it is extremely important when you're using React because this kind of JavaScript is used a lot in React, especially when you're working with states. Basically what this means is when you put the 3 dots over here, you're just saying that you want to make an array that is composed of everything in this list plus this value over here. So that means that now I can just set the to-do list to be equal to the new to-do list. And what we're doing here is we're just adding the new value to the list. So this is amazing, right? It will be working. It is working, but we're not able to see it working for now because we're not displaying the value, the list inside of our UI. I could add over here, do homework, but there's nowhere where, like it added this task, but there's nowhere to be seen a list in our UI. So the way we're going to show that list is inside of our div over here for list, we want to grab the to-do list, which is a state, which is an array. And using what we learned in the 3rd episode of this course, we want to map through this list. Now, why do we want to map through this list? Because when you have a list and you want to display each element in the list in React as a UI element, you say the name of the list dot map, and then it will iterate through every element, and you just grab the task or each element in the array as an argument to a function, and inside of the function you just return some sort of UI that you want to display based on that specific element. So I want to display an h1 tag for each element in the to-do list. Now, what do I want to display for each element? Well, I just want to display the task that is being represented in that specific index. So if initially it should be empty because our array is empty, but when we add a new task, then it will loop through the array, it will go to that task and just put the name of the task inside of this h1 tag. So you can see that since we already added the do homework, now it's being displayed. But I'll refresh again so you guys can see. I'm going to say do homework. And when I click add task, now it just added it to the list. I could add more stuff like wash dishes. And it will keep adding. Let me do another thing. Clean room. And you can clearly see that our list is working. It is adding to each element in the list, then it is looping through the list and just displaying it in our screen. So this is the basis of how a to-do list works. There's some optimizations or just things that we could do to make this look better. For example, code-wise, I usually don't separate the array into a separate variable and then set the list like this. I just did this so you guys could have a better idea of what is happening here. I usually just copy this and put it inside of here without creating a new variable, and this will work the same way. Now, everything else is looking good, right? It's it's basically 29 lines of code, 31 lines of code for a pretty cool project, right? We can add a bunch of stuff, and it's looking pretty nice. So this is to emphasize how quick you can write complex code in React without writing a lot of code at all. So what we want to do now is we want to make this project look a little bit cooler, right? We want to add some functionality that will definitely bring up the value of this project. And the first thing we want to do is we want to add the ability to delete a task. So deleting a task would be, if I don't want to do homework anymore, there will be a little button right over here, which we can click, and this will be removed from the list. So how can we do something like this? Well, the first thing we want to do is add the button for each element in the list, and we can easily do that by coming to our to-do list map over here and say that for each element in the list, instead of just returning the name of the element, we can actually return a div, and this div will include not only the task name but also a button, which we'll just put an X to represent delete, and you'll see that this is exactly how it looks. At the end, like I said, I'll add some CSS and everything will look a little bit better, so you guys can copy the CSS. But for now, let's just leave it like this. But you can see that each element now has a button, which doesn't do anything when I click, but we're going to obviously add the functionality in a bit. So in order to delete a task from the list, we're going to create a function over here called delete task, right? And this function will be called whenever we click on that button. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put an on click to this button. Now, what I want to explain to you guys is the following. How am I going to know inside of this delete task function which element in the list we want to delete? Because we want to delete a specific element, right? So how are we going to know which one we want to delete? Well, we can actually, inside of the delete function over here, we can pass an argument to it, which we're going to get the specific task that we can delete. So for now, let's just try deleting it by using the name of the task over here. So I could come over here inside of this function, say that it accepts a task name. And over here inside of an onClick, you might imagine that I could just come over here and pass the task from the to-do list map as the argument to the function. But there's an important thing I want to mention to you guys. In React, when you have an onClick like this, and you have a function that has a parameter, so something that they have to put inside of parentheses over here, you can't just put it like this. This format like this is just for functions that don't have a parentheses or arguments in its parentheses. When we have something like this, we actually need to create a function that returns this function call. So this is kind of weird, but just know that whenever you have a parenthesis like this, you gotta write this syntax over here, which basically is you're creating a new function and you're calling the delete task function. So what we can do now is we could come over here instead of our delete task function, and we could do this similar to the add task. We're gonna set the to-do list to be equal to a new array. Now with when we're adding a new element, all we're doing is we're just creating a new array with everything that the to-do list had before and the new task that we want to add. But when we want to delete something, we actually need to use something called the filter function. Now the filter function, I mentioned that it is important for you to already know this, but if you don't, I'll go over really quickly what this is. So imagine you have an array over here, right? This is an example. If I had an array which had the following elements, it had the name Pedro, it had the name Jessica, and it had the name James. And I want to get this array, keep it the same, like create a new variable over here, right? Call it new array. But the difference is I want to keep every element in this array but Pedro. So I want to delete Pedro from this array. I want to create a new array which Pedro isn't in there anymore. To do that, I could do the following. I could say array.filter like this. Then it's going to loop through every element, and I can grab the element in the array like this. Let me call it name over here. And for each element, I'm going to ask, okay, if the name is equal to Pedro, then return false, else return true. So we're going to say else over here, return true. So why are we doing something like this? Well, the filter function, it takes in a function inside of it, which you return true to the elements you want to keep and false to the elements you don't want to keep. So in this case, we're just asking, okay, if the name variable, so if the element in the array is equal to Pedro, then return false. If it's not, return true. So I'll explain why this is useful for our case. Because we can just go through every element in the to-do list and say, okay, if the task is equal to the task name, then remove it. If it's not, keep it. So return false when the task is equal to the task name, and return true when it's not. So we could do something exactly like that. I'm gonna delete this over here, and I'm gonna again create a new to-do list. So a new to-do list, set it equal to the old to-do list.filter like this, and I'm gonna loop through each of them, and for each task in this to-do list, we're gonna run the same logic. We're gonna say if the task is equal to the task name that we're grabbing from this from the map over here, from the call of the function, then return false because we don't want to keep it. Else over here, we want to return true. So we will then have an array with everything but the element we want to delete, which is the whole point of this. And then we can just set the to-do list to be equal to that. So we can test this by coming over here and adding more elements to our to-do list. So I'm going to say do homework, and then I'm going to say wash dishes. And you'll see that now when we click on the delete button, I can delete do homework, and do homework is not here anymore because it looped through every element in the list and it deleted all of them which had the name do homework. Now, if you look at this logic over here, it looks kind of complicated because it has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of code. You can actually make this into one line of code, and it looks a lot better. Why can you do something like that? Well, because you can just say something like this. Instead of having an if-else statement, you can just say return if the task is not equal to the task name. So what it's going to do is if it is equal to the task name, which is the element we want to delete, then it will return false. If it is not, for every element, it will return true. You'll see that the same logic now still works, right? If I add do homework over here and wash dishes, and I delete wash dishes, it will delete wash dishes and keep do homework, meaning it's working. You can even condense this even further by removing the curly braces over here and the return statement and just doing something like this, and it will still work because that's just how JavaScript works. And even better, like I mentioned over here, we don't even have to create a new variable. We can even just grab this and put it inside of here. And this whole logic is now condensed into a single line of code, which still works, and it's amazing. You can see I can still delete it. So it's looking perfect, right? But there's an issue with this, an issue that I purposefully didn't tell you guys till now, because I feel like I need to go through the wrong part first to then explain to you guys why we're gonna fix this in a different way. So the issue is the following. If I write a task called do homework over here, and I write another task called do homework again, right? I want to be able to delete the first do homework without deleting both of it at the same time, right? It doesn't matter if I have two tasks with the same name. They're different tasks because I added them separately, right? But at the moment, this won't be possible because if I delete one of them, it deletes both, because what it's doing right now, it's looping through every element in the array, and it's deleting all of them with the name equal to the name that we want to delete. So if two elements have the same name, both of them will be deleted, which is not good at all. So what we can do to fix something like this is we have to have some sort of identifier to differentiate each task in the list. Now, what kind of identifier we can use? Well, an identifier that is extremely common in every web development project out there, which is a variable called ID for each element in the list. So now, instead of having a to-do list, which is just an array of strings, right? An array that is like do homework or just a string, right? We can now have actually each task be an object like this, an object, which has an ID, for example, 1, and a task name, which is equal to do homework, right? With this way, we're now going to have more information for each task, which we can use to differentiate them. And you'll see how this can grow to be even better when we write the part of updating the task. So this is what we want. We want to change this to, instead of taking strings inside of this array, we're going to take an object, which is going to have an ID and a task name. So let's delete this over here because I was just explaining to you guys. And how we're going to do this is, first of all, when we add a new task, we don't want to just set the new array to be equal to the old array plus the new task, because new task is a string and not an object. What we want to do is we're going to create this object over here for whenever we want to add a task, which will have an ID and it's going to have a task name, which is what we said we wanted before. Task name, we know it will be the value for new task, and we'll just pass this over here. But what we will put for the ID? Well, the first element in the list, we want the ID to be 1, right? Because it's the first element in the list. The second one, we want it to be 2. The third one, it will be 3. So what we want to do is we want to grab the element in the array before the current one and just add 1 to that ID. So it would be something like this. I would say to-do list, then go to-do list.length like this, -1, meaning we want to go to the previous one, the previous element, the last element before the one that we want to add right now. And we're going to grab the ID for that element and add 1 to it. If you're confused by this logic, I can go over again. Basically, we're just grabbing the ID of the last element and we're adding 1 to it, because now we're adding a new element and we want the ID to increment by 1, right? That makes sense. But there's an issue with this, an issue that is pretty obvious. Initially, the array is empty, so there's no ID to the last element. So what we can do is we can ask over here first, if the to-do list.length is equal to 0, right? We're going to use a ternary operator. We're going to say if it's equal to 0, then the ID will be 1. Else, we'll just grab the previous element like we said before, and we're going to add 1 to it. So if it's a second element, it will be 2. If there's a third, it will be 3. I understand if this is a bit confusing, especially because we're in the beginning of the course, but if you guys are interested, just let me know any questions in the description and I'll be able to answer everything. Also, we have a community on Discord, which is going over this course. So if you're interested in checking that out, just go in the description. You'll see the link for the Discord. So this logic makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense for you too, but let's continue forward. So over here now, we are adding a new task, which is perfect. But despite the logic here being correct, it's breaking now. You see, it's breaking. Every time I want to add a new task, it breaks. The reason is because we updated the format of the to-do list, of how it looks of this array. Now, instead of being a string, it's an actual object. So when we're displaying over here, we can't just say something like display the task, because task now is an object and not a string. If I want to display like it was before, I have to say task.taskName like this, and you'll see that now it's adding as well. But the delete button is still broken, because it looks like it isn't, but it is still broken because basically we're passing the whole object over here, when instead of that we want to actually pass the ID, and now we want to delete the element by using the ID instead of using the task name. So we're going to change this to say task.id, and instead of this delete task function, all we're going to do is we're going to change this to ID, and we're going to say if the task.id is not equal to the ID that we just passed, then you want to delete it, right? So let's try that again. Let's say do homework. We're going to even write it twice, right? We're going to use the same thing twice, just like how we did before. Before, we were going to delete it based on the name. So both of them would be deleted because they both have the same name. But now what I expect is this one over here to have an ID of 1 and this one over here to have an ID of 2. And since we are now deleting by the ID, we should only delete 1. which is exactly what happens. It looks like it deleted the wrong one, but it's just because the list updated and now the second one is in the first position. But you can see now we can have multiple tasks with the same name. So our project is looking kind of nice, right? My plan with this is I want to actually just add some CSS right now so it looks a little bit better. I know a lot of people like to see something visually pleasing while they work with. So I'm gonna just write some CSS, come back with the CSS. You'll be able to see the CSS. If you even want to copy the CSS, the link for the code will be in the description, so you can just check it out. And then we're gonna come back to do the exercise for this episode, which you guys will write it, and I'll show you guys the solution after you guys write it. So just like I did in the previous episodes. So I'll be back in a second after I've written some CSS just to show you guys how it looks. Okay, everyone, so we're back, and this is the CSS changes that I made. It's not a lot. I just changed the color of this, made it look like semi-okay. I don't care that much about CSS. Like I said, the whole point of this course is React and not CSS. But you can see this is how it looks now. Still works the same. We can add more. We can add tasks. We can add multiple tasks and just delete them. And if you're interested in just copying the CSS, which again it's not even that good, this is the CSS that I wrote. It's not a lot. It will all be in the description, so check it out. So what I want to do now is I want to first try to show you guys how to use components to make this look a little bit better, and then I'm gonna present you guys the exercise for this video. So we've talked about components before, right? And components make it easier for you to abstract a lot of logic into a single compact function, right? So the kind of logic I'm talking about is JSX, which is a mix between JavaScript logic and like HTML or UI. So we can implement components over here by taking away this part over here and putting it into a single component. The reason for that is because this part, think about how it's represented, right? It's a piece of UI that is consistently being changed depending on a different value for some sort of data, such as the task name and the ID. So if I wanted to create a component for representing this, I could come over here and I could create a file called task, for example, and I would just create the component, which we all know is just a function in JavaScript with a capital letter first and a function that will return UI. So the UI we're going to return is this over here. So I can just copy this and paste it over here. Now, obviously, we need to take in props for this to work. So over here at the top, we can just say props like this, and simply come over here and say props.taskName and props.id. Same thing as before. It just works the same way. But the difference now is instead of having all of this stuff over here, I could just have a return and return the task component that we just created, right? It just abstracted the whole logic for that, the whole UI for that, and put it in a different file in a different component. Now we have to import this component. So I'm going to come over here and I want to export this, right, by exporting. And then over here, I can just say import from, and then we put the path to that file. So it's the task file because it is in the same level. And then I just want to import the task component. So now this should be working the exact same way, but we do have to pass the props that we determined that we need to get over here. The two props that we need is a task name prop and an ID prop. So we'll just come over here and say task name like this, and we'll pass the task.taskName, and we'll get an ID, which is task.id. So now we get both of those pieces of information directly from the props, and it should be working the exact same way. Oh, it says delete task is not defined. Oh, so that's another thing I wanted to mention. We have this delete task function over here, right? And we need to access it inside of the task component. But how exactly are we going to do something like that? Well, the way we can do something like that is by, for example, passing this delete task function inside of as props for this task component. Now we could copy this and paste it over here, and you would imagine that this would work the same way, but it wouldn't because we don't have access to the set to-do list or the to-do list inside of our component. We could pass both of those pieces of information as props, but it's much easier for us to, instead of doing something like this over here, we can just say props.deleteTask and just grab just pass the delete task as a prop to this component, just like this. So if you didn't know this, you can pass everything as prop. You can pass variables, just like numbers and strings, but you can also pass functions. So we're just passing this to this component, the task component, and accessing it over here. And you can see that it still works the exact same way as before, which is amazing. So this is how we would abstract this, make this look a little bit better, because now we just have this task component and all of the UI is over here. So now what I want to do is I want to present you guys the exercise for this episode. The exercise is creating the update functionality, like I mentioned in the beginning. So what is the update functionality? Well, I want to have a little button over here in the task, like similar to the X, the delete button. We can have another button right over here, and we'll just say complete. And when I save this, you'll see that this is how the button looks, right? So what I want is to be able to click on this complete button over here, and it will make the task be completely green, right? So every task that you complete, it will become green to symbolize that the task has been completed. To do that, I'll give you a hint. You have to create a new property inside of inside of this object over here. Instead of just having each task having an ID and a task name, you can have another thing, for example, called completed, which will be a Boolean, like false or true, and use that to change the value and use that to determine which tasks are completed or not. Now, I'm going to obviously show you how this is like the solution for this, but I want you to do this on your own. I'll also tell you that for updating something like this, you will not use the filter function. You'll do something similar to this, but you will use the map function. So you can do whatever you want to solve this. You can try on your own if you already have an idea of how to do it. You can also just look tutorials online or anything like that, or just search online how to do something similar. I'm obviously going to explain to you guys at the end of this video, but I'll give you some time to do this and come back whenever you're ready. Okay, everyone. So this is the solution to how to do something like that. You see that right now we have over here, we could add a task, and if I'll just do another one, wash dishes. And if I want to complete one of the tasks, I can just click on this and it will become green to represent that it's been completed. And it will work with every other one as well. So the way we can do something like this is, like I mentioned, we'll have a field called completed, which will be a Boolean to determine if the task is completed or not. It will start out as false, but if we click on the button, it will call this complete task function, which is the main part where we work with some logic, right? So I mentioned that you guys want to use the map function, because the map function allows you to loop through the to-do list or any array, and for each element you can change its element depending on some sort of condition. So over here the condition is if the ID of the task is equal to the ID that we want to complete, then I want the element in that list, that element, then I want that specific element to remain the same, but the completed property in it, so this thing over here, will now be true instead of false. So if you've never seen this syntax over here, the 3 dots mean the spread operator. It means that you basically, is this structure, you're basically saying that you want to keep the whole object the same, but the field completed will be now set to true. And if it's not the element that we want to complete, then we return task, because it is just, we want to keep it the same. So if you're not familiar with map, then it's one of the things that I assume you should know for this course. It's a JavaScript function, but this is the whole point of it. Whatever you return will be replaced in the list. So we're replacing, in this case, with completed equal to true. And in this case, we're not replacing it at all. We're just keeping it the same. And then we pass this complete task function to our task as props, and we also pass the completed property from the task as props as well, because now in our task over here we call that complete task function just like we did with the delete task, like this. And also, to make it green, we add a style to our div like we did in the previous episode, and the style, we change its background color depending on if it's completed or not. If it is completed, we make it green. If it's not, we make it white. And all of this allows us to have a project, a to-do list that works perfectly as we wanted in the beginning. So again, I know this all might seem a little bit confusing because it's the first time we're actually using a lot of logic in React. We're doing a lot of states and stuff like that. But I don't want to overwhelm you guys, although I think it might a little bit. I remember this was the hardest thing for me in the beginning, but just being able to play around with the code and understanding everything really helped out. The points that I want you guys to spend the most time understanding is how the addition part of the to-do list works, how the deletion works, and how the updating or the completing works, because this over here will be massively useful for us later on in the course. Understanding the filter and the map function are extremely important. Also understanding the part where we just separate into a component and how props work. It'll just refresh your knowledge on stuff that we've worked in the past, so I would recommend you also spending some time. If you want to check out the code, will all be in the description. And this is basically it for this episode. This was probably one of the longest episodes, especially in the beginning portion of the course, because it is a long topic and it is a very important one. So if you're interested in watching more videos, just keep around and feel free to leave a comment down below asking whatever you want. I'll be there to answer. If you liked the video, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm going to be posting 3 times a week this course until we're done, and I would really appreciate it. So with that in mind, thanks for watching, and I see you guys in the next episode.